In a busy courtroom in the heart of Chicago, the air was thick with tension. Lawyers shuffled papers, witnesses fidgeted in their seats, and spectators whispered quietly to each other, trying not to draw attention. At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, a young lawyer whose name few people knew but whose determination burned brighter than anyone could have guessed. She wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to see in such a high-stakes trial. With her simple clothes and calm demeanor, she looked more like someone who worked at a library or a small cafe rather than a fierce advocate in a legal battle. Karoline had spent years working hard to get where she was today. After graduating from law school with modest grades, she hadn't landed a glamorous job at some big firm. Instead, she chose to help ordinary people, those who couldn't afford expensive lawyers and often felt crushed by the system. It wasn't easy work, and it certainly didn't make her rich, but it gave her purpose. Now, standing before Judge Harold Grayson, one of the toughest judges in the city, she found herself facing the biggest challenge of her career. The case revolved around Alex Reed, a mechanic accused of stealing money from his employer, Titan Tech Industries. The company claimed that Alex had manipulated financial records to siphon off thousands of dollars for himself. If convicted, he would face serious consequences, not just jail time, but also a ruined reputation. For Alex, this trial meant everything. He swore he was innocent, insisting that someone else must have set him up, but proving that in court wouldn't be easy, especially against Titan Tech's team of experienced attorneys. Karoline glanced over at the prosecution's table. There sat Benjamin Cole, a tall, confident man in his late 40s with perfectly styled hair and an expensive suit. Next to him was Rachel Meyer, another seasoned lawyer known for her sharp tongue and even sharper mind. They were both smiling faintly, clearly enjoying what they saw as an easy win. To them, Karoline was nothing more than a rookie, a nobody who didn't stand a chance. At the front of the room, Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. His voice boomed across the courtroom as he called the session to order. "Let's begin," he said sternly, his eyes scanning the room. When they landed on Karoline, there was a flicker of amusement in his expression. He had seen countless inexperienced lawyers come through his courtroom, and most of them crumbled under pressure. Something about Karoline's quiet confidence seemed to irritate him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Benjamin Cole rose to present the prosecution's opening statement. He spoke smoothly, painting Alex as a greedy opportunist who took advantage of his position at Titan Tech. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his tone dripping with authority, "this is not just a case of theft. It's a betrayal of trust. Mr. Reed abused his access to sensitive information for personal gain, leaving his employer to pick up the pieces." As Benjamin continued, Karoline listened intently, taking notes and occasionally nodding along. She knew better than to interrupt or show any sign of weakness. Still, she couldn't ignore the occasional snickers from the gallery behind her. Some of the spectators seemed entertained by how outmatched she appeared. Others exchanged knowing glances, already convinced that the outcome was inevitable. When it was finally Karoline's turn to speak, she stood slowly, smoothing out her skirt as she gathered her thoughts. Taking a deep breath, she addressed the judge and jury. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "What you're about to hear isn't just a story of alleged wrongdoing. It's a story of a good man caught in a web of lies and deceit." Her words hung in the air for a moment, drawing curious stares from the crowd. Encouraged by the sudden silence, she pressed on. "Alex Reed has devoted his life to serving others, whether it's fixing cars for neighbors or supporting his family. He is not perfect, but he is honest, and today we will prove that he is being unfairly targeted by a powerful corporation eager to protect its own interests." But before she could elaborate further, Judge Grayson interrupted with a dry chuckle. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you'll forgive me if I don't hold my breath waiting for that proof. You seem ambitious, I'll give you that. But ambition alone won't win this case." The courtroom erupted into low murmurs, and Karoline felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She forced herself to stay composed, reminding herself that Losing her cool would only play into the judge's hands. "Thank you for your feedback, Your Honor," she replied politely, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I assure you the evidence will speak for itself." Judge Grayson smirked, clearly amused by her response. "We'll see about that," he said dismissively, waving a hand to signal her to continue. Karoline returned to her seat, her mind racing. She knew the judge's skepticism wasn't unusual. Many people doubted her abilities because of her age and lack of experience. But she also knew something they didn't. She had spent months preparing for this trial. Every document, every witness statement, every piece of evidence had been meticulously analyzed and cross-referenced. She had even reached out to experts in forensic accounting and cybersecurity to ensure she understood every technical detail of the case. Back at her desk, Karoline glanced at Alex, who sat nervously in the defendant's chair. His knuckles were white from gripping the edge of the table, and his eyes darted around the room as if searching for a lifeline. Seeing him so vulnerable made Karoline even more determined to fight for him. She gave him a reassuring smile, silently promising that she wouldn't let him down. As the morning wore on, the prosecution called its first witness, Daniel Carter, a senior accountant at Titan Tech. Dressed in a neatly pressed suit, Daniel took the stand with an air of authority. Benjamin wasted no time diving into questions about the discrepancies in the company's financial records. Daniel explained in great detail how certain transactions traced directly back to Alex's login credentials, making it appear as though he had tampered with the data. Karoline listened carefully, jotting down notes and watching Daniel's body language. Though he sounded convincing, she noticed subtle signs of discomfort, hesitations, slight shifts in posture, and fleeting glances toward Benjamin as if seeking approval. These were tiny clues, but to Karoline, they hinted at a deeper truth. When it came time for cross-examination, Karoline approached the witness stand with deliberate calmness. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice soft yet firm, "you mentioned earlier that Titan Tech relies heavily on automated systems to process financial transactions. Is that correct?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, that's correct. Would you agree that these systems are not infallible? That errors can occur due to software glitches or human oversight?" "Well, yes, theoretically," Daniel admitted reluctantly. "But in this case, we conducted thorough investigations and ruled out any possibility of error." Karoline tilted her head slightly, feigning curiosity. "Interesting. So tell me, Mr. Carter, have you ever been disciplined by Titan Tech for falsifying reports?" The question hit like a thunderclap. Daniel froze, his face turning pale. Murmur rippled through the courtroom as everyone leaned forward, eager to hear his response. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, suddenly more alert than before. I don't know what you're talking about," Daniel stammered, glancing nervously at Benjamin. "Oh, really?" Karoline countered, pulling out a printed document. "According to internal memos obtained during discovery, you were formally reprimanded 3 years ago for altering quarterly earnings reports to make the company appear more profitable. Isn't that true?" For the first time since the trial began, the courtroom fell completely silent. Daniel squirmed in his seat, unable to deny the accusation. Benjamin shot Karoline a venomous glare, realizing too late that she had anticipated their strategy and prepared accordingly. Judge Grayson leaned forward, studying Karoline with renewed interest. Though he didn't say anything, his expression suggested that he might have underestimated her after all. As the session adjourned for lunch, Karoline allowed herself a small, private smile. The battle was far from over, but she had taken the first step toward proving that justice wasn't reserved for those with power and influence. It belonged to everyone willing to fight for it. After the dramatic cross-examination of Daniel Carter, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people filed out for the lunch break. Karoline Leavitt walked briskly back to her table, her mind racing with what had just happened. She knew that exposing Daniel's past misconduct was a critical moment in the trial, but she also understood it wasn't enough to win the case outright. The prosecution still had plenty of ammunition, and Judge Grayson, though slightly more attentive now, remained skeptical of her abilities. Karoline sat down at her desk, pulling out a notebook filled with scribbled notes and highlighted documents. She flipped through the pages, double-checking her strategy for the afternoon session. Alex Reed, sitting beside her, leaned over cautiously. "Do you think we're getting somewhere?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Karoline looked up at him, offering a reassuring smile. "We're making progress," she said. "But we can't let our guard down. There's still a lot to do." Alex nodded, though his worried expression didn't fade. He trusted Karoline, but the stakes were incredibly high. If they lost this case, his life would be ruined. He couldn't imagine going to prison or being branded a thief for something he didn't do. Karoline could see the fear in his eyes, and it only strengthened her resolve to fight harder. As the lunch break ended and the courtroom filled up again, the atmosphere felt different. Spectators whispered among themselves, speculating about how Karoline had managed to catch Daniel off guard. Even some of the jurors seemed more engaged, their earlier indifference replaced by curiosity. Judge Grayson entered the room, his usual stern demeanor softened slightly by the intrigue of the unfolding drama. The prosecution resumed its case after lunch, calling another witness, Sarah Bennett, a mid-level manager at Titan Tech. Sarah was calm and composed, exuding confidence as she took the stand. Benjamin Cole approached her with a warm smile, clearly aiming to rebuild the prosecution's momentum. "Ms. Bennett," he began, "can you tell us about your role at Titan Tech and your involvement in investigating the alleged embezzlement?" Sarah nodded professionally. "Certainly. As part of my responsibilities, I oversee internal audits and ensure compliance with company policies. When irregularities were discovered in the financial records, I led the investigation into the matter." Benjamin nodded approvingly. "And what did your investigation reveal?" "Our findings pointed directly to Alex Reed," Sarah replied without hesitation. "His login credentials were used to access sensitive files, and the timing of the EA transactions coincided with his shifts at the office. The prosecution's narrative was clear. Alex had both the opportunity and the means to commit the crime. To an outsider, it seemed like an open and shut case, but Karoline wasn't convinced. She watched Sarah closely, noting the rehearsed quality of her answers. Something about her testimony felt too polished, almost scripted. When it came time for cross-examination, Karoline stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. She approached the witness stand with a polite smile. "Ms. Bennett," she began, her tone friendly but firm. "Thank you for taking the time to testify today. I'd like to clarify a few points if that's okay." Sarah nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Of course. You mentioned earlier that Alex's login credentials were used during these suspicious transactions. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct." "And how many employees at Titan Tech have access to the same system Alex uses?" Sarah hesitated for a split second before answering. "Several dozen employees have similar access levels. So, theoretically, anyone with those credentials could have carried out the transactions, right?" "Well, technically, yes," Sarah admitted. "But Alex's credentials were specifically flagged because they matched the timestamps of the suspicious activity." Karoline nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And how often does Titan Tech update its cybersecurity protocols to prevent unauthorized access?" "We review and update our systems regularly," Sarah replied confidently. "Security is a top priority for us." "Interesting," Karoline said, pausing briefly to glance at the jury. "Then perhaps you can explain why, according to our independent analysis, Titan Tech's software has multiple vulnerabilities that could allow hackers to bypass security measures and use valid employee credentials without detection." The courtroom erupted into murmurs once again. Sarah's composure faltered and she glanced nervously at Benjamin, who was frantically flipping through his notes. I'm not sure where you're getting that information," she stammered. Karoline smiled faintly as she pulled out a thick folder filled with technical reports. "These findings come from Dr. Laura Bennett, a retired forensic auditor and cybersecurity expert. She reviewed Titan Tech's systems extensively and identified several weaknesses that could have been exploited." Judge Grayson leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Is this expert available to testify?" he asked. Karoline nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. In fact, she's scheduled to take the stand later today." The judge gave a curt nod, signaling his approval. Meanwhile, Sarah struggled to recover, offering vague responses to Karoline's follow-up questions. By the time the cross-examination ended, her polished facade had cracked, leaving the jury with lingering doubts about the prosecution's claims. With the prosecution's witnesses starting to unravel, Karoline decided it was time to introduce her own evidence. After a short recess, she called Dr. Laura Bennett to the stand. Dr. Bennett was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, with sharp features and an even sharper intellect. Dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, she radiated authority as she swore to tell the truth. Karoline guided Dr. Bennett through her qualifications, highlighting her decades of experience in auditing and cybersecurity. Then she moved on to the crux of her testimony. "Dr. Bennett, based on your analysis of Titan Tech's systems, what did you discover?" Dr. Bennett adjusted her glasses and spoke clearly. "Titan Tech's financial software contains significant vulnerabilities that could allow unauthorized users to access and manipulate data. These vulnerabilities include outdated encryption methods and insufficient monitoring of user activity." She went on to explain how hackers or malicious insiders could exploit these weaknesses to frame innocent employees like Alex. Her testimony was technical, but presented in a way that even non-experts could understand. Karoline occasionally interjected to clarify key points, ensuring the jury grasped the implications of Dr. Bennett's findings. Benjamin Cole tried to challenge her during cross-examination, questioning the validity of her methods and conclusions. But Dr. Bennett remained unshaken, countering each objection with precise logic and supporting evidence. By the end of her testimony, the prosecution's argument looked considerably weaker. As the day drew to a close, Judge Grayson called for a brief recess before delivering any further instructions. Karoline returned to her seat, feeling a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. She knew the trial was far from over, but she had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the jurors. For the first time since the trial began, she sensed a shift in the courtroom's energy, a glimmer of hope that justice might prevail. Alex leaned over again, his voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "You're amazing." Karoline smiled softly, patting his hand. "Don't thank me yet. We've got a long road ahead." Despite her cautious optimism, Karoline allowed herself a moment of reflection as the courtroom emptied. She thought about all the late nights she had spent poring over documents, the countless hours spent strategizing with experts, and the sleepless nights worrying about whether she was doing enough. It hadn't been easy, but every step of the journey had brought her closer to this point. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered eagerly, hoping to catch a glimpse of Karoline or get a comment about the day's events. But Karoline avoided them, choosing instead to focus on preparing for the next phase of the trial. As she walked back to her office, she reminded herself of one thing. Winning wasn't just about proving Alex's innocence. It was about showing the world that even the smallest voices deserved to be heard. And she was determined to make sure Alex's voice rang loud and clear. The third day of the trial began with a somber atmosphere. The courtroom was quieter than usual, as if everyone sensed that the stakes were rising. Karoline Leavitt arrived early, clutching a stack of documents and a notebook filled with her meticulous notes. She looked calm on the surface, but inside she was bracing herself for what lay ahead. Today was the day she planned to reveal the centerpiece of her defense, a piece of evidence so compelling that it could change the entire trajectory of the case. Alex Reed sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly together. He had barely slept, the night before, haunted by the fear of what might happen if things went wrong. "Do you think we're ready?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with anxiety. Karoline turned to him, her expression steady and reassuring. "We've done everything we can," she said. "Now it's time to trust the process." As the judge entered the room and called the session to order, the tension in the air grew palpable. Judge Harold Grayson adjusted his glasses and scanned the room, his gaze lingering briefly on Karoline. Though he still carried an air of skepticism, there was a hint of curiosity in his demeanor now. The young lawyer had proven herself capable of surprises, and he seemed eager to see what she would do next. The prosecution resumed its case, calling Richard Moore, Alex's direct supervisor at Titan Tech, to the stand. Richard was a tall, imposing man in his early 50s with a commanding presence and a no-nonsense attitude. He took the oath confidently, looking straight ahead as if he had nothing to hide. Benjamin Cole approached him with a warm smile, clearly hoping to reinforce the prosecution's narrative. "Mr. Moore," Benjamin began, "can you describe your relationship with the defendant, Alex Reed?" Richard nodded. "I supervised Alex for several years. He reported directly to me and handled various administrative tasks, including processing invoices and maintaining financial records. And during this time, did you notice any unusual behavior from Mr. Reed?" "No," Richard replied firmly. "He always seemed like a reliable employee, until these allegations came to light." Benjamin nodded approvingly. "Can you tell us about the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the alleged embezzlement?" Richard launched into a detailed explanation, describing how discrepancies in the financial records led investigators to trace the suspicious transactions back to Alex's login credentials. His testimony painted Alex as careless and opportunistic, someone who abused his access for personal gain. The prosecution's argument was clear. Alex had both motive and opportunity, making him the most likely culprit. When it came time for cross-examination, Karoline stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. She approached the witness stand with a polite smile, her eyes locked onto Richard's. "Mr. Moore," she began, her tone calm but probing, "thank you for your testimony. I'd like to ask you a few questions if that's okay." Richard nodded curtly, though his expression betrayed a flicker of unease. "Go ahead. You mentioned earlier that Alex processed invoices and maintained financial records. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct." "And how often did you review his work? Did you personally oversee his tasks?" Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Not every task, no, but I reviewed his work regularly, to ensure accuracy." Karoline tilted her head slightly, feigning curiosity. "So you trusted Alex to handle sensitive financial data without constant supervision?" "Well, yes," Richard admitted reluctantly, but only because he had proven himself reliable in the past. "I see," Karoline said, pausing to let the jury absorb the implication. "Then perhaps you can explain why Alex was never given formal training on the company's financial software or cybersecurity protocols." Richard frowned, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" Karoline pulled out a document and handed it to the bailiff to pass along to Richard. "This is a copy of Titan Tech's internal training records. According to these documents, Alex never attended any mandatory training sessions related to the software he allegedly misused. Isn't that true?" Richard glanced at the paper, his face reddening slightly. "That may be accurate, but it doesn't excuse his actions." "No, it doesn't," Karoline agreed smoothly. "But it does raise questions about whether Alex fully understood the system he was accused of manipulating. Wouldn't you agree?" Before Richard could respond, Karoline pressed on. "One more thing, Mr. Moore. Can you confirm that you were present when Alex signed certain documents related to the disputed transactions?" Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yes, I was present." "And did you explain the nature of those documents to him at the time?" "Well, not in great detail," Richard admitted. "They were standard forms, and I assumed he knew what he was signing." Karoline's smile widened ever so slightly. "So, to summarize, you relied on Alex to handle sensitive tasks without proper training, and then you asked him to sign documents without explaining their purpose. Is that correct?" Richard opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Karoline's questions hanging heavy in the air. Even Judge Grayson leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed in thought. With Richard's credibility shaken, Karoline decided it was time to drop her bombshell. After a short recess, she called her final witness, a security guard named John Miller who worked at Titan Tech's headquarters. John was a middle-aged man with a kind face and a nervous habit of fidgeting with his tie. As he took the stand, Karoline reassured him with a gentle smile. "Mr. Miller," she began, Thank you for being here today. Can you tell us about your role at Titan Tech? John cleared his throat nervously. I'm one of the night shift security guards. My job is to patrol the building and make sure everything is secure. Were you working on the evening of March 15th last year? Karoline asked. Yes, I was. And did anything unusual happen that night? John hesitated, glancing toward the prosecution's table. Karoline noticed his hesitation and spoke gently. Take your time, Mr. Miller. Just tell us what you remember. Finally, John nodded. I saw Mr. Moore in the office late that night. He was using one of the computers in the finance department. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Benjamin Cole shot to his feet, objecting loudly. Your Honor, this is hearsay. There's no proof. Judge Grayson raised a hand to silence him. Let her continue. Objection overruled. Karoline thanked the judge and turned back to John. Did you find it unusual to see Mr. Moore in the office so late? Yes, I did, John replied. Most managers leave by 6 or 7. It was almost midnight when I saw him. And did you report this incident to anyone? No, I didn't think much of it at the time. But later, when I heard about the investigation, I started wondering if it was connected. Karoline nodded solemnly. Thank you, Mr. Miller. That will be all. As John stepped down from the stand, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier certainty wavering. Even Richard Moore looked visibly rattled, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. To drive her point home, Karoline introduced surveillance footage from Titan Tech's security cameras. The grainy video showed Richard entering the finance department late at night, sitting at a computer and typing furiously for nearly an hour. While the footage didn't explicitly show him committing fraud, it painted a damning picture of suspicious behavior. Benjamin Cole tried to downplay the video during his rebuttal, arguing that it proved nothing concrete, but the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and the prosecution's case was beginning to unravel. As the day drew to a close, Judge Grayson adjourned the session, reminding everyone to return the following morning for closing arguments. Karoline gathered her papers and returned to her desk, feeling a mix of exhaustion and triumph. She glanced at Alex, who was staring at her with wide, grateful eyes. You're doing amazing, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Carolina smiled faintly, though her mind was already racing ahead. Tomorrow would be the final showdown, the moment when everything she had worked for would either pay off or fall apart. But for now, she allowed herself a small measure of hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and she was determined to see it through to the end. The 4th day of the trial dawned with a sense of anticipation hanging over the courtroom. Everyone knew this was the day that would decide the fate of Alex Reed, and perhaps also define Karoline Leavitt's career as a lawyer. The gallery was packed with spectators, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, and even a few curious employees from Titan Tech who had shown up to witness the conclusion of the high-stakes drama. Karoline arrived early, clutching her notes tightly. She looked calm on the outside, but inside she felt like a storm was brewing. Every word she said today mattered. Every argument she made could tip the scales one way or the other. She glanced at Alex, who sat beside her, his face pale but resolute. He gave her a small nod, trying to convey his trust in her despite the overwhelming pressure they both felt. Judge Harold Grayson entered the room promptly at 9 o'clock, his expression unreadable as always. He adjusted his glasses and called the session to order. We will now hear closing arguments, he announced, his voice steady and commanding. The prosecution may proceed. Benjamin Cole stood up confidently, smoothing out his suit before addressing the jury. His tone was measured but forceful, designed to leave a lasting impression. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, pacing slowly in front of them. This case is not complicated. It's about accountability. Alex Reed had access to sensitive financial data, and he abused that privilege for personal gain. The evidence speaks for itself. His login credentials were used to manipulate records, and the money trail leads directly back to him. He paused dramatically, letting his words sink in. Yes, there have been attempts to muddy the waters with talk of software glitches and vague theories about hackers, but let's not lose sight of the facts. At the end of the day, Alex Reed is responsible for what happened. He betrayed the trust placed in him by Titan Tech, and he must face the consequences. As Benjamin concluded, he turned toward the jury with an air of finality. Justice demands that we hold individuals accountable for their actions. Do not be swayed by distractions or emotional appeals. This is a clear-cut case of theft, and I urge you to deliver a verdict that reflects the truth. When Benjamin returned to his seat, the courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to Karoline, waiting to see how she would respond. For a moment, she remained seated, gathering her thoughts. Then, with deliberate calmness, she rose to her feet and walked to the center of the room. Her movements were unhurried, her posture confident yet humble. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice soft but firm. "What you've heard over the past few days isn't just a story of alleged wrongdoing. It's a story about fairness, integrity, and the power of assumptions. Benjamin Cole wants you to believe this is a simple case, but life rarely works in black and white. Sometimes the truth lies hidden beneath layers of complexity, and uncovering it requires patience and courage." She paused, glancing at each juror individually, ensuring they felt seen and heard. Alex Reed isn't perfect. No one here is denying that. But being imperfect doesn't make someone guilty. What makes someone guilty is evidence. Solid, undeniable proof. And that's exactly what the prosecution has failed to provide. Karoline stepped closer to the jury box, her tone growing more passionate. "Let's revisit the facts. Yes, Alex's login credentials were used during the suspicious transactions. But does that automatically mean he committed the crime? Not when the software Titan Tech relies on is riddled with vulnerabilities that could allow anyone to exploit it. Not when Richard Moore was caught on camera sneaking into the finance department late at night. And certainly not when Alex himself was coerced into signing documents without understanding their purpose." Her voice softened slightly as she continued. "This case isn't just about Alex. It's about all the ordinary people who find themselves caught in systems designed to protect the powerful. Titan Tech didn't train Alex properly. They didn't monitor their own systems effectively, and when problems arose, they pointed fingers instead of taking responsibility." She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "I'm asking you to look beyond the surface. Look at the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. Look at the doubts raised by our witnesses. Look at Alex, not as a nameless defendant, but as a human being who deserves fairness and justice." For her final point, Karoline leaned forward slightly, her tone becoming almost intimate. "Justice isn't blind because it refuses to see. Justice is blind because it refuses to discriminate. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, experienced or inexperienced, powerful or powerless. Justice belongs to everyone willing to fight for it. And today, Alex is fighting for his life, for his freedom, his reputation, and his future." With that, she returned to her seat, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. The courtroom was utterly silent, the weight of her words lingering in the air. Even Judge Grayson seemed affected, his usual stoic expression replaced by something akin to contemplation. After a brief pause, Judge Grayson instructed the jury to begin deliberations. As they filed out of the room, Karoline exhaled deeply, feeling the tension drain from her body. She turned to Alex, who looked at her with tears in his eyes. "You did everything you could," he whispered hoarsely. "Whatever happens, thank you." Karoline managed a small smile, though her mind was still racing. She knew the jury's decision wouldn't come quickly. They had a lot to consider, but she also knew she had given them plenty to think about. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. While the jury deliberated, the courtroom emptied gradually. Spectators drifted away, reporters scrambled to file updates, and even some of the lawyers retreated to quieter spaces to wait. Karoline stayed put, refusing to leave Alex's side. Together they sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of activity outside the room. Hours passed, each minute stretching longer than the last. Finally, the bailiff re-entered the courtroom and informed Judge Grayson that the jury had reached A verdict. The judge nodded solemnly and called everyone back to their seats. The atmosphere grew electric as the jurors filed in, their faces carefully neutral. Once everyone was settled, Judge Grayson addressed the foreman. Has the jury reached a unanimous decision? The foreman stood up holding a folded piece of paper. We have, Your Honor. A hush fell over the room as the clerk retrieved the verdict form and handed it to the judge. Judge Grayson scanned it briefly before handing it back. With a grave expression, he turned to the foreman. Please read the verdict. The foreman cleared his throat and unfolded the paper. On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendant not guilty. The words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then Alex let out a choked sob, burying his face in his hands. Karoline felt tears welling up in her own eyes as she leaned over to hug him tightly. Around them, murmurs broke out among the spectators, some cheering quietly, while others shook, their heads in disbelief. Judge Grayson banged his gavel to restore order. Once the noise subsided, he addressed the court. Mr. Reed, you are free to go. However, I must commend Ms. Leavitt for her exceptional work in presenting a compelling defense. While I may not always agree with her methods, I cannot deny her skill and dedication. Karoline blushed slightly at the unexpected praise, bowing her head respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. As the trial officially came to an end, Alex stood up shakily, gripping Karoline's hand tightly. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice trembling. You saved my life. You saved yourself, Karoline replied gently. I just helped show everyone the truth. Outside, the courthouse reporters swarmed around them, shouting questions and snapping photos. Karoline shielded Alex from the chaos as best she could, guiding him toward a waiting car. Despite the whirlwind of attention, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This victory wasn't just for Alex. It was for every person who ever doubted their ability to stand up against injustice. As the car drove away, Karoline leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. She knew this win wouldn't erase the challenges ahead, nor would it shield her from future battles. But it proved one thing beyond doubt. Even those who laugh at you today may stand in awe of you tomorrow. And sometimes that's all the motivation you need to keep fighting. The aftermath of the trial felt surreal to Karoline Leavitt. As she stepped out of the courthouse, the cool evening air brushed against her face, a stark contrast to the heated tension that had filled the courtroom just moments before. Reporters shouted questions from every direction, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. Alex Reed walked beside her, his steps hesitant but lighter than they had been in weeks. He looked around, bewildered by the sudden attention, and gripped Karoline's arm tightly for support. Are you ready for this? Karoline asked softly, leaning closer so he could hear her over the noise. Alex shook his head, laughing nervously. Not really, but I guess it comes with the territory. Karoline nodded, offering him a reassuring smile. Just stay calm. You don't have to answer anything you're not comfortable with. With that, she guided him toward a quieter corner of the courthouse steps, away from the chaos. A few reporters followed, shouting questions about how she had managed to win such an improbable case. Karoline ignored them for the most part, focusing instead on making sure Alex was okay. She knew the spotlight would fade eventually, but for now it was important to protect him from being overwhelmed. When they finally reached the car waiting for them, Karoline opened the door and helped Alex inside. Before climbing in herself, she turned back to address the crowd briefly. Thank you all for your interest, she said firmly, raising her voice just enough to be heard. But my client needs time to process everything that has happened. We'll release a statement later. With that, she slid into the car and closed the door, signaling the driver to leave. As the vehicle pulled away, Alex leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. I still can't believe it's over, he murmured, running a hand through his hair. For months I thought there was no way out. And then, you came along. Karoline smiled faintly, though her mind was already racing ahead. Winning the IE case was one thing, but she knew the real work wasn't done yet. Titan Tech might appeal the verdict or worse, try to retaliate against Alex in other ways. Still, for now, they had won a crucial battle, and that was something worth celebrating. You deserve this, Karoline told him sincerely. You fought hard, too, even when it felt hopeless. Never forget that. Alex nodded, his eyes glistening, with unshed tears. I owe you everything, Karoline. If it weren't for you, I'd probably be sitting in a cell right now. She waved off his gratitude modestly. It's my job to fight for people like you. Besides, you trusted me when no one else would. That takes courage. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. The city streets blurred past the car windows as twilight settled over Chicago. Eventually, Alex broke the quiet. What happens next? Do we need to worry about Titan Tech coming after me again? Karoline hesitated, choosing her words carefully. There's always a chance they might try something. File an appeal. Maybe even accuse you of defamation if they think they can intimidate you. But for now, the jury's decision stands, and we have legal grounds to defend you if they do anything unethical. Alex frowned, clearly uneasy at the thought of more trouble ahead. Do you think they will? It's possible, Karoline admitted. Big companies like Titan Tech don't like losing, especially when it makes them look bad. But don't let that worry you too much. Focus on getting your life back together first. Let me handle the rest. He nodded slowly, seeming to take comfort in her confidence. Okay, thanks for looking out for me. Later that evening, Karoline returned to her small office, exhausted but unable to relax. The adrenaline from the trial still coursed through her veins, making it hard to sit still. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at her desk, staring at the stack of files and notes scattered across its surface. For months, these documents had consumed her life, and now, suddenly, they felt almost meaningless. Her phone buzzed, incessantly with notifications, texts from friends congratulating her, emails from potential clients eager to hire her, and even a voicemail from a local news station asking for an interview. Karoline ignored them for the moment, needing time to process everything that had happened. She picked up a pen and began jotting down reminders for follow-up actions, drafting a formal statement for the press, reviewing the court transcripts for any errors, and preparing Alex for possible retaliation from Titan Tech. As she worked, her thoughts drifted back to Judge Grayson. His unexpected praise during the trial had caught her off guard, but it also made her reflect on her career. She had spent years working tirelessly to prove herself in a field dominated by people who doubted her abilities. This victory wasn't just about vindicating Alex. It was validation for her own journey, proof that determination and preparation could overcome even the toughest obstacles. A knock on the door interrupted her musings. Startled, she glanced, up to see Laura Bennett, the forensic auditor who had testified on their behalf, standing in the doorway. Hey, I hope I'm not disturbing you, Laura said, smiling warmly. Not at all, Karoline replied, gesturing for her to come in. What brings you here? I just wanted to congratulate you in person, Laura said, taking a seat across from her. That was some impressive lawyering back there. You handled everything perfectly. Karoline chuckled, shaking her head. Hardly perfect. There were times I wasn't sure we'd pull it off. Well, you fooled everyone else, Laura said, with a grin. Seriously, though, you've got a gift. Keep using it. Thanks, Karoline said, feeling a swell of pride despite herself. I couldn't have done it without your help, though. Your testimony was crucial. Laura waved off the compliment modestly. Just doing my part. Anyway, I won't keep you. I know you've got a lot to sort through. After Laura left, Karoline found herself smiling despite the long day. It felt good to be appreciated, especially by someone whose expertise she respected so much. She returned to her notes feeling re-energized and ready to tackle whatever came next. The following days passed in a blur of activity. Karoline gave a brief statement to the press, emphasizing the importance of holding corporations accountable and ensuring justice for ordinary people. Her words resonated widely, earning her praise from advocacy groups and sparking discussions about corporate accountability in mainstream media. Meanwhile, Alex began rebuilding his life. With Karoline's guidance, he filed complaints against Titan Tech for negligence and coercion, hoping to prevent others from facing similar situations. Though the process would take time, he felt hopeful for the first time in months. For Karoline, the trial marked a turning point in her career. Offers poured in from clients seeking her representation, and several law firms approached her about partnership opportunities. Yet despite the newfound recognition, she remained grounded, remembering why she became a lawyer in the first place. One evening, as she packed up her office for the day, Alex called her. "Just wanted to say thanks again," he said, his voice warm with gratitude. "Things are starting to feel normal again, or at least as normal as they can be." "I'm glad to hear it," Karoline replied, smiling. "Take care of yourself, okay? And don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything." After hanging up, she stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker below. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she knew she had proven something invaluable, not just to others, but to herself. Justice wasn't guaranteed. It had to be fought for piece by piece, and Karoline Leavitt was ready to keep fighting one case at a time.